And thank you all for logging on this evening and joining us. My name is Kate Neal, and I'm a pastoral associate at Sacred Heart and Our Lady Help of Christians Collaborative in Newton, and I'll serve as your MC tonight. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Please keep yourself muted for the duration of the event. We recommend that you set your Zoom to speaker view so that you'll have the best view of whoever is speaking at the time. You can do this by floating your cursor on the top of the screen and clicking the view icon. As this night is meant to be a conversation, we encourage you to utilize the chat function throughout the event to share your questions and comments. During the half-hour conversation portion of this evening, I'll be gathering all your questions and comments from throughout tonight to share with the speakers and attendees. I will do my best to get to as many of those as possible. To submit a question or comment in the chat, float your cursor to the bottom of your screen and hit the chat icon. Presenters and facilitators will not be responding to the chat outside of the conversation portion of the evening. If you have a technical concern that you think we could help you with, please chat directly to our technical coordinator, Phil Mandeville. You can chat him directly by floating your cursor over his picture and clicking on the 3-dot ellipses icon. Thank you so much for your participation, and without further ado, I welcome Sacred Heart and Our Lady's own Good Shepherd, our pastor, Father Dan Riley.
Hi, everybody. A warm welcome. I had a wonderfully, thoroughly prepared 3-minute introduction, but I want to hear the speakers more than me, so I'm turning it over to Peter.
Thank you, Father Dan. I'm very honored to introduce our first speaker on the humanitarian imperative for creating a world without nuclear weapons, Dr. Ira Helfand. Ira is a physician whose long service of caring for patients in his office and in emergency situations has translated into his global leadership in the effort to do away with all nuclear weapons, the most deadly weapons man has ever devised. Ira has led the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, its US affiliate, the Physicians for Social Responsibility, and he's a guiding light in ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. Dr. Helfand, we're very pleased to have you speak to us tonight from Northampton, Massachusetts.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks to everyone from Sacred Heart, Our Lady, for arranging this event tonight and for affording me the very great privilege of sharing this virtual podium with Archbishop Wester, whose recent pastoral letter has really been a light in this otherwise very dark time. You know, back in the 1980s, most people were very aware of the danger posed by nuclear weapons, and they took action to try to end the Cold War arms race, and they were successful. And when the Cold War arms race ended, all of us began to act as though this danger of nuclear war had gone away. It hadn't, of course. The weapons were still there, but I think we were all just so relieved that the Cold War was over, that we didn't want to think about nuclear weapons anymore, and we just put the danger out of mind. But the weapons remained. And over the last 4 or 5 years, the danger they will be used has increased dramatically. Tensions between the United States and Russia, between the United States and China, between the United States and North Korea, between India and Pakistan. In all of these areas, tensions have grown, and with them, the danger that nuclear weapons will be used. And then finally, on February 24th, an actual hot war broke out involving a major nuclear power when Russia invaded Ukraine. And the NATO alliance chose to support Ukraine in its effort to remain independent. These events have brought us literally to the brink of nuclear war. We are the closest we have been since probably the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s. And it is imperative that we understand fully what is at risk here today. So I want to start by describing a little bit what will happen if these nuclear weapons are actually used, the medical consequences of nuclear war. We have found that when we have a conversation about nuclear weapons that uses the medical consequences as the starting point, the conversation is very different than the conversation which the diplomats engage in. They talk about nuclear game theory. And the outcome of that conversation is very different as well. It's very hard for us to understand, to really grasp what a nuclear war will look like. Most of us have images in our mind of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We've seen the pictures. And these are very important warnings to us of what nuclear weapons can do. But the most important thing that we need to understand about Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that they do not begin to prepare us for the level of destruction that will occur if nuclear weapons are used again. Because if there's a modern nuclear war, it won't be one or two relatively small nuclear weapons on one or two cities. It will be many weapons on many cities. And most of these weapons will be anywhere from 6 to 50 times more powerful than the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We don't know the exact targeting strategy of either the United States or the Russian Federation, but what we do know suggests that a major city like New York or Moscow or Washington would be targeted, again, not with one weapon, but with 10 or 15 or 20 nuclear warheads in the range of 100 kilotons to 800 kilotons, 100,000 to 800,000 tons of TNT. It's very hard to visualize what that would look like. So I'm going to use a model of a single very large nuclear explosion, a 20 megaton, 20 million ton bomb. The megatonnage involved in that model is actually somewhat greater than we expect would be used against most cities. The destruction I'm going to describe is actually a substantial underestimate of what will happen, because you cause more damage if you use many smaller bombs and spread them out more efficiently, if you will, over the entire target area. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of that bomb, a fireball would form, reaching out for 2 miles in every direction, 4 miles across. Within this area, temperatures would reach 20 million degrees, hotter than the surface of the sun, and everything would be vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself would disappear. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the explosion would generate winds greater than 600 miles per hour. Mechanical forces of that magnitude could destroy anything that human beings can build. To a distance of 6 miles in every direction, the heat would be so intense that automobiles would melt. And to a distance of 16 miles in every direction, the heat would still be so intense that everything flammable would burn. Paper, cloth, gasoline, heating oil, they would all ignite. Hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next half hour would coalesce into a firestorm, 32 miles across, covering over 800 square miles. Within that entire area, the temperatures would rise to 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the oxygen would be consumed, and every living thing would die. In the case of New York City, we're talking about perhaps 12 to 15 million people dead in half an hour. And if this were part of a large-scale war between the United States and Russia, that kind of destruction would occur in every major city in both countries. And if NATO were drawn into the conflict, most of the great cities in Canada and Europe as well. All told, perhaps 200, 300, possibly 400 million people dead in an afternoon. In addition, the entire economic infrastructure in all of these countries would be destroyed. All the things that people depend on to keep themselves alive. There'd be no internet, there'd be no electric grid, there'd be no food distribution system, there'd be no public health system, there'd be no system for distributing fuel oil or heating oil. And in the months following that attack, most people who survived the initial bombing would also die from exposure, from starvation, from radiation poisoning, from epidemic disease. But these are only the effects in the countries directly involved in the war. And we have to understand that a nuclear war on this magnitude would involve the rest of the world as well, because a large-scale war between the United States and Russia would put something like 150 million tons of soot in the upper atmosphere, blocking out the sun and dropping temperatures across the planet an average of 18 degrees Fahrenheit. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, the temperatures would drop 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. We have not seen temperatures on this planet that cold since the coldest moment of the last ice age. And under these conditions, which would persist for a decade or more, all the ecosystems which have evolved since the end of that last ice age would collapse. The vast majority of the human race would starve to death, and we might become extinct as a species. Even a more limited nuclear war, as might take place between India and Pakistan, would be a global catastrophe unparalleled in human history. The death toll would be in the tens of millions of immediate fatalities, and there would still be enormous climate disruption, not quite as bad as a war between the United States and Russia, but bad enough to have a catastrophic effect on food production across the planet, enough to trigger a global famine that would put billions of people at risk of starvation. This wouldn't be the extinction of our species, but it would be the end of civilization as we know it. No civilization in history has ever withstood a shock of this magnitude, and there is no reason to believe that our current delicate economic infrastructure that we all depend on would do any better. It's critically important that we understand that what I've just described is not the scenario for some bad science fiction movie. This is the danger that we are living with every day that we allow these weapons to continue to exist. And we need to understand that this kind of destruction can occur at any moment. In the current conflict, both Russia and NATO have made explicit threats to use nuclear weapons. We are living in the insane situation where a handful of people in a handful of countries have the ability to destroy the entire world. And we are reduced to asking them to please not do this. So why is it important that we talk about this? Because the terrible destruction that I have just described is the future that will be if we don't take action. If these weapons continue to exist, it is not a question of if, it is only a question of when they will be used. But the more important point is, this is not the future that needs to be. Nuclear weapons are not a force of nature. Far less are they an act of God. We have built these weapons with our own hands. They are little machines about the size of the chairs we're all sitting in. We know how to take them apart. We've dismantled more than 50,000 of them already. All that is lacking is the political will to dismantle the 13,000 that still remain in the world. And that is where we come in, because we need to create that political will. Around the world, millions of people have come together in support of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was advocated by civil society and by a handful of countries that do not possess these weapons, and are determined to make the countries which do have them dismantle them. That treaty was negotiated in 2017. It entered into legal force in January of 2021. And it stipulates that for countries which sign the treaty, not just the use of nuclear weapons, not just the testing of nuclear weapons, but the simple possession of nuclear weapons is illegal and prohibited. This was an enormous step forward, but it did not go quite far enough yet, because the 9 countries which possess these weapons have not joined the treaty process. And we need to make sure that they do. Here in the United States, we have launched the Back from the Brink campaign to bring the United States into compliance with the treaty, to bring about a fundamental change in US nuclear policy, so that it is based not on the false idea that nuclear weapons make us secure, but on the accurate understanding that nuclear weapons are the greatest threat to our security. And therefore, for our sake and for the sake of people all around the world, it has to be our highest priority to eliminate these weapons before they eliminate us. Back from the Brink calls on the United States to enter now into negotiation with the other 8 nuclear armed states for a verifiable, enforceable, time-bound agreement to eliminate their nuclear arsenals. It also calls on the United States to take 4 interim steps while these negotiations proceed, things that will lessen the danger of nuclear war while the negotiations are in progress, and which will give impetus to the negotiating process. We call on the United States to renounce the first use of nuclear weapons, to promise we will never use them first. We call on the United States to end the situation where the President of the United States has unchecked authority to launch nuclear weapons. We call on the United States to take its nuclear weapons off of hair trigger alert so they are not vulnerable to cyber attack or to accidental launch. And we call on the United States to end the plan to spend something like $1.7 trillion over the next 3 decades to modernize and enhance every aspect of our nuclear arsenal. Now, we can't know if this initiative will be successful. We don't know if we can convince the United States government to adopt this policy. And if it does, we can't know that the other nuclear armed states will respond favorably to this initiative. But we have to try, because we do know what's going to happen if we do not get rid of these weapons. The fate of the earth, which rests on all of our shoulders, is a terrible burden. And it is difficult for all of us to confront the responsibility which we bear, not just to ourselves, not just to our children, but to our ancestors, whose heritage we are prone to destroy, and to all of our descendants, whose lives will not be if we don't take action. No one of us can deal with this problem alone, but no one of us has the right to step back from that portion of the job which is ours to do. And I think what we really need to remember is that this is a struggle which we can win. In the 1980s, we were convinced correctly that we were heading towards nuclear war if we did not make a fundamental change in US and Soviet nuclear policy. And millions of people took action, and we stopped the Cold War arms race. And I believe that everyone who was involved in that effort played a part in saving the world. We know we can do this. We've done it before. All we are challenging ourselves to do today is to repeat what has already happened. I think each one of us wants to do something good with our life. Those of us living today have been given the opportunity to save the world. And there's absolutely nothing better that anyone can ever do with his or her life. And so I think we need to confront this responsibility, this burden, with that perspective, and understand the extraordinary opportunity we have been given to save all mankind. It says in Deuteronomy that God said, "Behold, I have set before you life and death. Therefore choose life, that you and your children might live." That is literally the choice before mankind today. And so let us pray that we choose wisely and that we act with courage and determination and perseverance so that we and our children might live. And let us be buoyed by the hope that we can and will be successful in this struggle. Thank you.
Thank you for your work and your words, Dr. Heflin. I'm now going to invite Peter Metz to introduce our next speaker.
I'm also extremely pleased to introduce our next speaker on the moral imperative for creating a world without nuclear weapons, John Wester, the Archbishop of Santa Fe, New Mexico. Archbishop Wester is a pastor whose care and concern for his flock, like Dr. Helfand, has translated into action to eliminate nuclear weapons. As he tells it, his concern was aroused by a visit to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the contrasts he saw in the New Mexico History Museum celebrating the creation of the very bombs that had destroyed those cities and some 200,000 people. This concern and much research, learning, and listening led him in January to issue a remarkable pastoral letter making the case for doing away with nuclear weapons and calling for a conversation on nuclear disarmament in the light of Christ's peace. Like Pope Francis, who has repeatedly termed even the possession of nuclear weapons immoral, John Wester is providing moral leadership on this issue. It was his remarkable pastoral letter that prompted us to create tonight's event. And it is his and Dr. Helfand's leadership that has prompted us to create the call to action that you will hear after Archbishop Wester speaks. Archbishop Wester, we're very pleased to have you speak to us tonight from Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm very grateful to you and to all of you, and I'm very honored to be speaking with Dr. Helfand. I've heard so much about you, Doctor. Jay Coughlin is here in New Mexico with me, and it's been a great inspiration to me with a New Mexico nuclear watch, and he speaks so very highly of you in very hushed tones, very reverent tones, and I can see why. And I just am so grateful to you to be speaking with you, and also to be speaking to all of you who are so committed to this extremely important cause. I'm, if I'm in a sense, a newcomer, if you will. I came to Santa Fe in 2015, and this was not at the top of my ministerial list of things to do when I got here. But as Peter mentioned, my visit to Japan and Hiroshima and Nagasaki with two bishop friends, and then my visit to the museum, I saw this relationship between Santa Fe and Japan. And it was not a relationship that I was proud of. And I thought, well, we do need to be in relationship. I'm going to speak about that a bit later. But I just wanted to say that for now, I come at this as a pastor, as so many of you do, from a moral point of view, as concerned citizens, and wanting to raise my voice with yours. And I'm humbled to do so. I just put a op-ed piece in the Santa Fe New Mexican, responding to a recent article that I read here, that the Los Alamos National Lab here in my archdiocese would get more than $1 billion increase in its proposed budget, ensuring the Department of Energy's fiscal year 2023 spending in the land of enchantment would actually exceed our whole New Mexico's entire state budget by about $1 billion. Out of that money, over 70% would go for programs that seek to indefinitely preserve existing nuclear weapons and build new plutonium pit bomb cores for the new design nuclear weapons. Further, much of the remaining money supports those nuclear weapons programs, such as about $450 million for waste isolation pilot plant, the dump for future radioactive waste from expanded pit production, which is another concern of ours. I just had a confirmation this morning at one of our pueblos, San Felipe, and some of their sacred land is used for the waste that's just put there in a very dangerous way, in my opinion, and it could certainly cause problems going forward. 40% of the Department of Energy's national nuclear weapons budget of $16.5 billion will be spent here in New Mexico alone, double that of any other state. In addition, New Mexico has the largest repository of nuclear warheads in the US, with up to 2,500 warheads held in reserve at Kirtland Air Force Base, just south of the Albuquerque airport. When I first came here, I was flying in and out of Albuquerque. I knew there was something going on down there, but I couldn't tell what it was. And now that I do, it's rather ominous. Our congressional delegation has always supported the nuclear weapons industry in the name of jobs. This needs to be critically examined, it seems to me, and questioned both morally and practically. Why is it that New Mexico consistently ranks near the bottom of all 50 states in the key socioeconomic indicators? Does the nuclear weapons industry benefit New Mexicans as a whole? The facts indicate no, they don't. For example, during the nearly 80 years that the nuclear weapons industry has been in this land of enchantment, as we call it, the Census Bureau data shows New Mexico slipped in per capita income from 37th in 1959 to 49th in 2019. Last year, in the US News and World Report ranking of best states to live in, New Mexico was third from the bottom and dead last in education. According to the New Mexico Human Service Department, we have the highest percentage of seniors living in poverty, and the second highest rate of overall poverty, suicide, and food insecurity among children. The land of enchantment was recently ranked 49th among all states in overall child well-being. Not coincidentally, New Mexico's population is 63% people of color who disproportionately bear the negative impacts of poverty. One can only imagine what $9.4 billion could do for New Mexicans in 1 year. Hire hundreds of new teachers, help protect us against increasing wildfire threats, secure precious water resources, provide medical care for the poor, and clean up contamination from past nuclear weapons production. Instead, it's going to nuclear weapons forever, even as the chances of potential nuclear war are increasing, and we already have global overkill many times over, as Dr. Helfand has described for us. The Vatican itself has evolved from conditionally accepting nuclear weapons as necessary for so-called deterrence to now declaring even their possession as immoral. Pope Francis made that very clear recently in the last couple of years, and he's repeated it again. He said it in 2019 and again in 2020, that even possessing nuclear weapons is immoral. To me, the moral needle took a huge tick. That made a huge difference in our moral assessment of even possessing nuclear weapons. Of course, this is because of what Dr. Helfand has already described, and because nuclear weapons indiscriminately kill everybody. And the nuclear powers have made zero progress toward the disarmament they promised to pursue in the 1970 Non-Proliferation Treaty. In fact, they're going backward with Russia's current nuclear saber rattling and our nation's $1 trillion nuclear weapons modernization program, as Dr. Helfand just mentioned. In truth, neither country ever really had just deterrence as its main goal. We know that that's not true because we have thousands and thousands more nuclear weapons than we need. The United States, I think, 5,500, Russia, about 6,257. If it was only just for deterrence, we would only need 100 or 200. But clearly we do have, it seems to me, plans for first strike capabilities and actually fighting a nuclear war. Given today's increased dangers, I like to quote former President Ronald Reagan, who said that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. The only value in our two nations possessing nuclear weapons is to make sure they will never be used. But then, would it not be better to do away with them entirely? And as former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara said of the Cuban Missile Crisis, rationality will not save us. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. I can remember that missile crisis in 1962. I was 12 years old, and I remember walking home from school. It's as vivid as I can, as if it were yesterday. I was on Glenwood Avenue in Daly City, right near San Francisco. And as a couple of planes were going overhead, we children were looking up and wondering if those were Russian planes. We were trying to see if there was Russian markings on the wings and if we should run home because we were afraid. But actually, I haven't been afraid like that, to be honest with you, since 1962. I do remember being told what to do when I was in public school, to hide under my desk. I do remember people talking about iodine, which, by the way, I understand from one of the Pax Christi groups. One country, I think is in the Netherlands, they're having a run on iodine now, which will tell you how people are so afraid today. But basically, I was, with everybody, I guess, in many ways, lulled in a false sense of complacency. And so when I saw what I saw in Japan and coming here to Santa Fe, it strikes me that we have a moral imperative from our church to do all that we can to disarm in a verifiable and complete way. I come upon it, I think, especially from a scriptural point of view. There's much that can be said, but my time is limited. But I know that we're called to live in right relationships with each other. That's a basic fundamental call of the scriptures and of our faith, our Catholic faith, and so many other faiths, major faiths throughout the world, and people with no faith, people who have just a common regard for the common good. These right relationships are critical to our existence. I love a quote from, if you'll let me quote you here, from Walter Burkhardt, a Jesuit who was a wonderful Jesuit. If I can find it here on my pages, but he Give me just 1 second. But he talks about the importance of right relationships. He talks about scripture this way. He said, those who read in the sacred text a surely personal, individualistic morality have not understood the Torah, have not sung the Psalms, have not been burned by the prophets, have not perceived the implications and the very burden of Jesus's message, and must inevitably play fast and loose with St. Paul. The social focus of God's book is evident on the first page. The song of creation is its overture. Our incredibly imaginative God had in mind not isolated units or autonomous entities, but rather a people, a human family, a community of persons, a body genuinely one. It is clear that nuclear weapons threaten the very fabric of these relationships God intends for us to have. We even traditionally speak of nuclear arms as existing in silos. When used, they would certainly force us into silos, fragmenting and destroying the life we hold sacred and relational. In fact, we would be lucky to be alive in silos. And so that's what I think really prompted this writing of the pastoral letter, Living in the Light of Christ's Peace, a conversation to our nuclear disarmament. And in the letter, I try to address those moral imperatives that would help us to do this. Dr. Helfand has laid out for us a very realistic and urgent message that we all should need to listen to. And I think it's bolstered by these other moral arguments that we make. As I said, Pope Francis was so clear in his position that even possessing them is immoral because they have the possibility of destroying our entire planet. If relationships, right relationships, are what we are all about, then we must make this a very urgent matter to get rid of those very things that would destroy every single relationship we have right now, that would destroy every relationship we have with the past, every technical advance, every medical advance, every advance in theology and philosophy. Our whole culture, everything would be completely destroyed. I'm discovering as I come into this more and more, and as I learn from all of you, I'm discovering that 2 things I see as obstacles in making this moral imperative argument. One, I have people say to me after I give a presentation, well, that's all well and good, but to be honest with you, I've got a lot of problems right now. I'm trying to pay the bills. I'm trying to deal with institutional racism. I'm trying to help my children and not be on drugs and alcohol. And I'm trying to escape this terrible cycle of poverty. And so that's one thing. A second thing that I'm discovering is that people, for whatever reason, I guess it's out of sight, out of mind. Maybe as Doctor says, we've been lulled in a false sense of complacency. But it seems like people just don't understand the destructive power. They don't seem to understand what nuclear weapons are capable of doing. I don't think they understand even how many we have. When I tell people how many weapons we have here in New Mexico, they seem to be very surprised by that. So I think that's why we have to really make our case, not only from the point of view that Dr. Helfand brings out, but also from a moral point of view. Some point to, for example, the just war theory and say, well, the Catholic Church and even our pastoral in 1983 does allow for deterrence and the just war theory. But again, without going into it, I think we can see that nuclear weapons make the just war theory completely obsolete, because the components of the just war theory talk about balance. They talk about wars being fought with balance. They talk about not targeting innocent civilians. They talk about not going beyond what the first perpetrator did. And all of these things are impossible with nuclear weapons. We can't have selection of say, we're going to destroy these people, but not those people, as Dr. Helfand has pointed out. The whole just war theory goes out the window. I think also we have to make the case for the money that's been being spent and continues to being spent on nuclear arms and that whole nuclear arms industry and the whole weapons industry in general. Again, imagine what that money can do for the poor. and for all those who are in need, and for teachers and things that we need. President Eisenhower said many decades ago, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening nuclear war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. I believe also that we need to take seriously Christ's message of peace. My fear is that for too long, we have watered down Christ's gospel of peace. I realize this is a complicated question. It brings into mind things like self-defense and things of those nature. It's a very difficult moral question. But Reverend Martin Luther King, I think, spoke eloquently about this. He said that some people say that, well, loving our enemies sounds idealistic. But he said Jesus was not an impractical idealist. He was a practical realist. I think that we have to have peace as a primary goal. Today's gospel for us, I think, says it all. Jesus says, love one another as I have loved you. We have to stop watering that down and take it seriously. And we have to realize that nuclear disarmament, verifiable nuclear disarmament, is something that is of the utmost urgency, because there's no way we can love each other as God has first loved us if we don't exist. I believe that in all of this, it's important for us then to really underscore the urgency. And I think I was touched very much by Dr. Helfand's reflections and talk, by the urgency of this matter and by communicating to people the urgency of the matter. As I pointed out earlier, you know, a lot of the reason we haven't had even worse catastrophes is really luck. We've had several here in Albuquerque. Decades ago, a nuclear bomb was dropped accidentally. And the only reason that it didn't detonate was that because there were 3 fail-safe switches, evidently, from what I've told. There was one low voltage switch, 2 of them failed, but the 3rd one did not, a little low voltage switch that did not. And because of that, it didn't detonate. And because of that, thousands of people were not killed. And so I think that we need to really underscore the urgency of this matter. And I think that the tragic and horrific situation in Ukraine does just that, sadly. Nuclear weapons are already being used today. Even though they're not being detonated, they're certainly being used as blackmail. And the very threat of them being used is something that is placing the entire world in a state of fear. And so I join all of you in making this plea that we do what we can, everything we can, to make this urgent for all of us, and to do what we can to do what we did before, as Dr. Helfand said, to really get everybody to support the TPNW, to support nonproliferation and verifiable nuclear disarmament, universal. I was interested when I went on the website, and I'll conclude with this, of our New Mexico Nuke Watch. They had a quote from General Omar Bradley. And as I'm getting into this more and more, I'm fascinated by some of the quotes of the scientists and generals who have an idea of the destructive power of nuclear weapons. General Bradley says, I'm sure many of you know this, but he said, ours is a world of nuclear giants and ethical infants. We know more about war than we know about peace, more about killing than we know about living. We have grasped the mystery of the atom and rejected the Sermon on the Mount. Pope Francis, in his Urbi et Orbi speech this past Easter, a few weeks ago, he quoted the Russell Einstein Manifesto. He said, here then is the problem which we present to you, stark and dreadful and inescapable. Shall we put an end to the human race, or shall humankind renounce war? My dear sisters and brothers, I pray that all of us can help answer that question, that we must not put an end to the human race. We must pray and work hard for verifiable universal nuclear disarmament, and we must work hard to build a world of peace and a world of right relationships. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Archbishop, for your words and for your work. And Now it's my pleasure to introduce Pat Ferrone, who is from Pax Christi, Massachusetts, and St. Susanna's in Dedham. And she is going to lead us in a call to action.
You're muted, Pat.
All right. Thank you both, Archbishop Wester and Dr. Ira Helfand. I've heard you you speak many times, Dr. Helfand, and I've appreciated you, and I've read carefully your letter, Archbishop, and we have used it in many ways already. So I do represent, I am from St. Susanna's, and I am on the Pax Christi, Massachusetts board, and I've been given 5 minutes to speak quickly to give you some takeaways. Some of this will be repeat information because it's been covered in some way, but I'll tell you, you don't have to take any notes. All the information that's presented, as well as the link to tonight's program, will be sent to you by email. So let's start with the pastoral letter itself. We have read it at St. Susanna's and had a great discussion group, and it was so very well received. So we can tell you to please share the pastoral letter widely. Send out the link to others or purchase the beautiful copies from Pax Christi USA. Bloom where you're planted, meaning start close to home with parish groups, friends, book clubs, family, whoever comes to mind, to discern, and then discern how to widen your reach to get it out to all kinds of other people. Ask parish priests and ministers to read the document and to speak up. It surely is time that we begin to hear this message from the pulpits of our churches. We rarely do, and that is truly a shame. So it is time for us to ask them to speak up, and if they don't, ask if you can do it yourself, perhaps after the conclusion of the Mass. Ask your bishops to endorse the letter. Write articles for local papers, and follow up. Let's see, and I'll tell you that Pax Christi, Massachusetts, through St. Susanna, has mailed copies to all the Massachusetts bishops, and will follow up with requests for meetings with them. Buy copies as gifts, put quotes in bulletins, start conversations, and keep them going. They can lead to education, exploration, cohesion, imagination, and transformation, and ways for people to grasp the urgency of the need to abolish nuclear weapons. Sign up for the upcoming Pax Christi USA study group, which will begin on May 17th. This is a way to expand your horizons and meet other people who are doing this work. Secondly, add your support individually or encourage your parish or town to sign on to the Back to the Brink campaign. This is a very important grassroots coalition effort composed of individuals, organizations, and elected officials working to secure common sense policies that put restraints on nuclear weapons as an interim step toward their total elimination. I would like to mention that the town of Needham, where I live, has actually done this, has endorsed the Back to the Brink campaign, and that was a hallelujah moment for all of us. I won't ask Phil to put the 5 asks of the Back to the Brink on the screen because it already has been mentioned, and you'll get the links when you get the handouts by email. In Massachusetts, I can tell you that 18 towns have already endorsed the effort, including Boston, Brookline, Newton, and Needham, and many faith, peace, health, and environmental groups around the country have also done this. Back from the Brink sees their work as providing a way for the U.S. to eventually join the United Nations Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was ratified in 2021, as Dr. Helfand said. Currently, I thought this was interesting, currently 60 state parties have ratified the treaty, and a further 29 have signed on, but not yet ratified. This represents 45% of all global states, which is, I think, a pretty remarkable number for the number of years that this effort has been put forth. The Vatican, through Pope Francis, was the first signatory to this treaty. I would suggest that you take time to read the unique approach in the creation of the TPNW, started by bringing the smaller states, the little guys, the ones with not as much power as the nuclear states, on board. Back from the Brink uses a similar approach, starting with just ordinary people, building coalitions to stand up and resist our nuclear arsenals. Third, why not send President Biden a message reminding him of his own convictions in 2017? You could say something like, President Biden, now more than ever is the time to act on your words. Quote, as the only nation to have used nuclear weapons, we bear a great moral responsibility to lead the charge to a world without nuclear weapons. I'd add a suggestion of my own, and I saw that this person was in one of the boxes here, and I'd suggest reading Art Laffin's recently republished book, The Risk of the Cross, Living Gospel Nonviolence in the Nuclear Age. It reminds us that our efforts must arise from a commitment to the nonviolence of Jesus and from a desire to transform the manifestations of all violence through our embrace of God's unconditional, all-embracing love that will help us to resist all that destroys life. And finally, I'm reminded of Phil Berrigan's words. It's as simple as this in terms of where our heart should be as faithful Christians in this case. At the center of Christian life is the commandment, thou shalt not kill, and its affirmation, love your enemies. He adds, if enough Christians follow the gospel, they can bring any state to its knees. Our question is, can we be part of the enough that entangles the powers that bury our children? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pat. And I hope that everyone will take these calls to action to heart. We really feel strongly that tonight, to have so many of you here to hear our wonderful speakers should come from a place of wanting to take action. So you'll be getting a follow-up email from us, and we hope you will take some action following this. So there's some wonderful conversation happening in the chat. Please make sure to read some of the longer comments fully on your own, because there's some really wonderful comments. But I'm going to start with some of the questions that people asked for our speakers. And one of the first questions that came across was that either speaker could answer the likelihood or unlikelihood that there could be a limited nuclear exchange in the near future.
I could take a stab at that. I'm not sure if the thrust of the question is whether there could be the use of nuclear weapons or whether it would remain limited. I think there's certainly a great danger that nuclear weapons might be used. Their use has been threatened repeatedly on the Russian side, and NATO has responded to that with nuclear threats of its own. And I think the conversation, the talking points made by world leaders around this are really frightening. They just, this discussion. So this is somehow normal that nuclear weapons might get used in this conflict. I think it's much less clear what will happen if a nuclear weapon or more than one nuclear weapon is used. War games that have been done in which NATO and Russia were directly involved in the conflict, any time that a nuclear weapon has been used by either side in these war games, they have always escalated to large-scale all-out nuclear war. It might be different if a nuclear weapon were used against a non-nuclear armed state like Ukraine. It's possible that would not escalate, but we certainly don't know that. And I think the simple fact that we have to entertain this question underlies the insanity of the situation that we have allowed to exist. As Archbishop Wester pointed out in quoting former Defense Secretary McNamara, we're not here today because we know what we're doing, because we've had wise leaders or a sound doctrine or infallible technology. We're here because we lucked out. It was luck that's prevented nuclear war. And the current policy of all of the nuclear weapon states is really nothing more than a hope for continued good luck. And our luck isn't going to last forever. And so I think that the situation, there's not a whole lot we can do about the immediate situation. The events are moving very quickly. We have, unfortunately, not enough leverage over the governments involved. But there are some things. My organization, International Physicians Prevention of Nuclear War, joined with 17 other Nobel Peace Laureates in a call for NATO and Russia both to pledge that they will not use nuclear weapons under any circumstances in the current conflict. That statement was placed on the Avaz petition site and got 1,070,000 signatures so far, pleading with the leaders of these nuclear armed states to promise they won't use their weapons. They haven't been willing to do it. They haven't responded at all to this statement. And I think that it's worth continuing to put pressure on them along these lines to demand that they commit publicly to not using the nuclear weapons. But more importantly, if we're lucky enough to get past this crisis, I think we need to make sure that we are never again in a situation like this. And that means we've got to build the movement necessary to get rid of these weapons once and for all.
It occurs to me too, and I don't defer to doctor, but I think that I agree wholeheartedly that when you look at how wars have started in the past, the situation got out of hand. And I think that those war games that they planned should demonstrate that, as doctor said. And the other thing that concerns me is that, the Ukraine situation, Poland and Romania and all those countries, they're all right there. And so, it reminds me of, remember the old days when flying and they had a smoking section and a non-smoking section, so you could be in the row right behind the smokers. Well, it didn't do much good. You're breathing in that smoke. Well, the same is true here. The radiation poisoning, the effects of a nuclear, even a tactical weapon being exploded in Ukraine, not to mention how horrific for the Ukrainians, but for those neighboring countries, and then how would we respond? It's fraught with peril.
Thank you. There were several people who asked a similar question to this one, and it's aimed at the Archbishop. And it was noted in one comment that what you said about the just war theory and the moral imperative links beautifully to the gospel that many of the Catholics in your archdiocese would have heard today, Jesus' commandment to love one another as I have loved you. And several people wanted to know how other bishops have received your letter. Have they embraced it? What will it take for them to embrace it? And how can we work with our pastors to see this issue as a life issue?
Well, thank you. The question is a good question. I think that I've had calls from my bishop friends who have been very supportive, and they're very happy with the letter, and they feel that it's urgent, and they're glad. I think particularly because I'm the Archbishop of Santa Fe, that's been an important fact. That, in other words, we were in the 80s and late 70s and 80s, this archdiocese was very vocal and very demonstrative and moving for an abolition of nuclear weapons. Then there was decades of other issues came up. And so I think we're trying to rejuvenate that. And I think that's important. I haven't gotten a whole lot of response from the bishops as a whole. We're going to be meeting in San Diego next month, and I expect to be able to talk to some of them, or they might mention it then. But my impression, it's only an impression anecdotally, is that that this issue is not something that's on the front burner for a lot of people. That just simply is not something that people are, now with the Ukraine situation that's changed somewhat, but I think people are still like prefer to have their head in the sand. And so I'm not sure how much that has to do with it, but so I'm just going to keep trying to do my best. And for example, I joined Pax Christi last week. I've been debating it, for a long time. And so now I realize that, well, so I can see in my own life that this is evolving, this whole, my whole, by being here in Santa Fe, and I'm beginning to get more and more involved. So I'm hoping that's the case with many of my brother bishops too. I know they're caring about this issue, they care about peace, but I just don't know. And the other thing I don't understand too is the politics of it. And that's what I'm interested in learning from you more. And but I think that there is a political position, frankly, that still thinks that, the United States somehow, we control things, and with our nuclear arsenal, and this is the way to go. That's that's false thinking. It's not good thinking, and it's going to get us all wiped out someday. So I think I'm not sure how the politics fits into this. I'm just not sure yet.
Thank you for that. So several comments were asking about the treaty on the prohibition for nuclear weapons. And one question was particular about whether it could be put into effect regionally, especially with the Ukraine, NATO, and Russia as a start to increase security for Russia and Europe. I don't know if Dr. Heflin, you would like to speak to that.
I'm not sure what is meant by putting it into effect regionally. I mean, certainly it is binding on the countries which sign it. So there are already areas like Latin America where many countries have signed and ratified the treaty, where it is effectively in place. The role that it can play in the conflict in Ukraine, certainly, if Russia and Ukraine both signed it, they would be eliminating on the Russian side the nuclear arsenal, on the Ukrainian side the possibility of ever having one. That might be something that would help to reassure people on both sides of that conflict. But I think that the really critical role that the treaty is playing right now is to help us all to stigmatize these weapons, to get past the idea that Archbishop Wester just referred to, that somehow or other it's okay to have these, which is a very widespread notion. There are a lot of people here in the United States in particular, but in other nuclear armed countries as well, who believe that there is a certain value in having these weapons. They confer prestige, they confer power, they enable the countries that have them, as we're seeing with what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, to bully their neighbors and hiding behind this nuclear shield. The United States has done this on a number of occasions as well. The role that the treaty can really play at this point is to point out that these are not weapons which are accepted by the world, that it is not something that makes you, one of the big boys to have nuclear weapons, that rather these are and should be seen as a badge of shame. The countries that have these weapons are the true rogue nations in the world. And that stigmatization process is really critical in creating the public will within the nuclear armed states to force their governments to get rid of the weapons. So I think that's the critical role that the treaty can play right now. And we need to universalize it. We need to get as many countries that haven't signed and ratified yet to do that. And we need to build pressure within the nuclear armed states for them to sign and ratify as well.
I'm reading a lot of comments in the chat about sort of a conversation about how the US is the world leader in the problem of nuclear weapons, and yet isn't taking the lead to make the change. But then people pose the question of how do you deal with actors such as North Korea, who make people very nervous, that they're exercising leverage and don't appear likely to stop, that there's not a lot of faith in our leadership, who there's this feeling of moving towards, on the brink of World War III. And so in a time like this, when fears are so high and there's so many actors that people are nervous about, even though many people commented we should be the ones people are most nervous about, how do we deal with this? How do we start to make people understand this call as not an irrational risk, as someone put it, or an invitation to attack, when there's that kind of fear out there?
Well, in terms of the Back from the Brink campaign, we're not advocating that the United States unilaterally disarm. We're advocating for universal disarmament. We're advocating that the United States take leadership in bringing about that universal disarmament by initiating the process in which all nuclear armed states agree to give up their nuclear arsenals. As I said earlier, there's no guarantee that this approach is going to work, but we really don't have any choice. There is no alternative to trying this. And there is the very positive experience of the 1980s, when at the height of the Cold War, with incredibly tense relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev reached out to the United States and said, this is crazy. We're going to kill each other and the whole world with us. We need to stop this. Will you talk about this? And he was fortunate that Ronald Reagan, which surprised many people, including most of his supporters, said, yes, we need to talk about this. Because as Reagan had observed, nuclear war can't be won and mustn't be fought. What we need to have happen today is somebody to play the role that Gorbachev played in the 80s, to say the emperor has no clothes, that the situation is insane, and that we need to do something very, very different. It could be somebody, it could be President Xi in China, it could be President Putin in Russia. I don't think it's going to be either of them that provides the leadership. And so it somewhat defaults to the United States, of the three major world powers, to play a leadership role here. And that's what we need to have the US do. We need to have us say publicly that we are actually actively going to seek the elimination of nuclear weapons, something which the United States has never done before, and hope for the best. And we need to do everything we can to support that initiative when it takes place, understanding that there's reason to be hopeful, because against all the odds, it worked in the 1980s. We get asked all the time about, what about North Korea? What about Iran? I share the view of somebody who put in the chat, in some ways, they're not the problem. I mean, they are a problem, but the real problem is the United States and Russia. We're the ones that have most of the weapons. And we need to provide leadership on this. I firmly believe that if the United States were able to convince Russia and China that we need to create a new world order based on the elimination of nuclear weapons, that the three of them working together could bring countries like Iran and North Korea along with them. They're able to the North Koreans are only able to maintain their nuclear arsenal because they play off the rivalry between the United States and China and Russia. If those three countries together said, it's over, the world is going to be free of nuclear weapons, and you're going to give up yours too, I don't think the North Koreans could or would resist that.
I think that's very true. And I think that's very promising, that approach. And furthermore, it could be continued on by, if you look at a lot of the reasons, in my opinion, why countries want to get these weapons, like North Korea or Iran, whatever, it's for bargaining power. They basically want to get food, they want to get medicine, they want to get other things. So I think if we were to come together through the auspices of the United Nations or whatever, to really try to solve some of the real problems that are besetting our globe, that would make a big difference. The reason that people are forced immigrants in our world today, there's a disproportionate distribution of food and medicine. And so I think these are the things that also have to be considered. It's not just the nuclear weapons, it's what the nuclear weapons seem to give to people. I think Dr. Helpman's point there is well taken. If we could frame it differently, that we're not this big superpower, but that we should be ashamed of ourselves, those countries that have such a proliferation of weapons, it would change everything and start really dealing with the issues.
In the chat, several people are urging people to follow different bills in the House and Senate to urge President Biden to commit to action. And one of the questions that came out of that is, what wording would you suggest we use when speaking to legislators or trying to move these leaders? Is there any particular wording that is most effective?
I think there are a bunch of different messages that can be important. For some people, the incredible economic waste is a critical issue. For some people, the moral arguments that Archbishop Wester has articulated so beautifully are an important argument. For some people, the security issue arguments that I've focused on, I think, and I think it's appropriate to raise all of these because they all have great validity. There are, we had a back from Brink bill in the legislature here in Massachusetts, which was killed in committee, unfortunately. But there is another bill before the Massachusetts legislature to set up a commission to study what the effects of nuclear war would be on Massachusetts. And I would urge people who in the audience who are here in Massachusetts to contact their state legislators and ask them to support the bill to establish a commission to study the implications of nuclear war for Massachusetts. And I think this could be a model for other states as well. It will create a commission that will hold hearings, that will do public education work, and that will draw attention, needed attention to this issue.
I think among those issues that, Doctor, you bring out is, I know here in New Mexico, I think the language that we would use would be for the jobs. That's an issue that comes up a lot with people, that if we don't have this money for Lawrence Livermore in California and Los Alamos and Sandia here in New Mexico, then all these jobs will be lost. But I think it's quite clear, and I've talked to, and I'm going to have a meeting up in Los Alamos with concerned Catholic scientists shortly, I hope. But I think that's one thing that we keep emphasizing, that my understanding is, as I get more into this, is that there will be a proliferation of jobs in the labs because we have to have the universal verifiable disarmament. And so we have the technology and the ability to create those systems and technologies that will enable us to verify that. And so that I think the jobs will be there. But I think that's another something we can't ignore that either. That's very important for people. And that, I think, it's back to the other, I think as you get more and more into this issue, you realize we're dealing with the life and death issue, which really, we see this as the most important issue right now. And it is, I think, in our world, the most important issue. However, people see other issues as more important. So we have to show that, show them that we do understand that we can't ignore that. And I think part of the other language, I think that's important, and I'm still struggling with a bit, but I know that some, especially from the religious point of view, talk about the whole question of the gospel of peace. And Dr. Helfand pointed out that, and in my letter, we're not calling for unilateral disarmament. From my beginning discussion with people, I think that would be, that wouldn't go over. I think we have to look realistically how this might happen. So the language we need to use is maybe an evolution. If we could move toward reducing nuclear weapons, getting down to the bare minimum, and then getting down to doing it by stages, I think people might find that more convincing or more palatable.
To follow on that, I think the one thing that the United States could do unilaterally right now would be to state unequivocally that nuclear weapons do not make the world safe, that they are the greatest threat to our security, and that it has got to be our highest priority to eliminate these weapons. That doesn't commit the United States to eliminating the weapons unilaterally, but it does redefine the entire conversation and make it clear that it is our judgment, the United States' judgment, if we adopt this position, that nuclear weapons must be eliminated. And that I think much would flow from that. That would really break up a logjam, because that hasn't been the position of the United States ever. We have always acted as though and believed that nuclear weapons were useful and that we gained something by possessing these weapons. And that complete reversal of policy is something that could be done quickly by this administration, by President Biden. He could do that in a speech this week.
Doctor, hasn't President Biden in the past, maybe when he was vice president or running for office before, hasn't he come out and spoken about this? Has he made, it seems to me that he made comments about the importance of this, but maybe I'm mistaken on that.
Oh, no, you're right.
No, I think he absolutely has. And I think they were referred to earlier in the program. He said in 2017 that the United States is the only country that had used nuclear weapons, had a special responsibility to lead the way to a world free of these weapons. He's also said explicitly that he favored the US adopting a no first use policy, but he's refused to do that since he's become president. And I think that's partly where we come in as well, because he's under enormous pressure politically not to do these things. We have to both put pressure on him to do the right things, but also create space where he can do that and feel that he's not going to, endanger everything else he's trying to do politically by taking a position that is not supported by the public. So that's part of our job I think is to create that space where the administration can follow its better instincts and do things which President Biden said he wants to do.
That's a very good point. I think also that a lot of people base their opinions on narratives that they've been given by our military and certain politicians, and they bought into that narrative, which is not necessarily true one. Even for example, that's one thing we left in the pastoral letter that is controversial. I admit it's great, and we almost took it out, but I thought, well, no, it does spark conversation, and that is, that there are those, and a book's even been written, that we dropped the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki just to show Russia that we have them and that we could use them and would use them, and that was part of the reasoning. And so I think that, there's been a lot of narratives put out there and I think a lot of our job is to correct that and to just to speak the truth.
There was a exchange in the chat about the idea of atoms for peace, harkening back to President Eisenhower's 1953 proposal to share nuclear technology for power with developing world. And people sort of responded to that that it was a negative program. And so could the speakers speak to the idea of nuclear energy, the developing world in relation to climate change, and how that fits in with a call to disarm?
I think nuclear weapons and nuclear power are somewhat separate issues, but they're also very closely related. The technology necessary to build and run a nuclear power industry is essentially indistinguishable from the technology needed to create fissionable materials for nuclear weapons. And we have seen that in practice. The Israeli, Indian, Pakistani, and North Korean nuclear weapons, all developed outside of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, were all developed out of programs that were supposed to be for peaceful use of nuclear power. We have to understand that if we promote the spread of nuclear power technology around the world, we are creating conditions that foster the spread of nuclear weapons as well. It's really as simple as that. And the argument is being made now in the face of obviously the great climate crisis that we need to have nuclear power in order to deal with that. I think there have been a number of very good studies that have shown that we can have a carbon-free future without resorting to nuclear power. And then in fact, every dollar that we spend on nuclear power would generate much more energy if it were spent on conservation or energy efficiency or true renewables. And so the money that's spent on nuclear power today is essentially being diverted from the real solution to the climate crisis. So from my point of view, I think that it is not useful or good for us to promote nuclear power. In fact, it's quite dangerous.
And I think too, from a religious point of view, from my perspective, another tangential argument might be, or at least an attitude, I remember hearing from a scientist, a Catholic nun years ago. She had a PhD in science, and she was talking about the fact that there has to be a certain humility on the part of humanity as we discover more and more revealing the scientific wonders that God has created, and that we as human beings are capable of developing. And that humility comes in when you talk about nuclear weapons or nuclear power plants. we're dealing with something that's very dangerous and very volatile. And as the doctor said, the connections are very serious. And also in terms of what we do with the nuclear waste, I know I've attended, when I was in Utah, the Energy Solutions took me out there and gave me a slideshow presentation. But even as a layman in this, many questions popped into my mind. There were many question marks about how safe the storage of these radioactive materials would really be in a massive earthquake or something of that nature. And I think that we have to have a certain humility and realize that just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do it. And I think we have to pull back from things that have the potential of being so destructive.
I think, Archbishop, that point about our need for humility is really important. You know, human civilizations existed for maybe 5, 7, 8,000 years. The radioactive materials that we produce in nuclear power plants remain dangerous for hundreds of thousands of years. And there's a certain real lack of humility in our assuming that we're going to know how to deal with this problem into the indefinite future, into a time span that greatly exceeds our entire human history as a civilization. We're creating these toxic materials that generations and generations and generations in the future are going to have to live with. And we don't have a solution. We don't know how to store them safely. And the assumption that we'll just figure it out somehow is really not very humble.
One of the questions is about civil disobedience and large protests. And is there a place for that now? And can you speak to whether you think that could make a difference in the current climate?
Well, I take a shot at that. I think that that is one of my dear a friend of mine over many years, Father Louis Vitale in California, Franciscan. And as many of you may know of him, I'm sure, he got very friendly with the judge there that put him to jail, I think over 50 times. But he was a protester. He engaged in civil disobedience. And I do think there's a place for that. I think everybody has to come to their own understanding of that, myself, in terms of, you know, what you should do, when you should do it, how you should do it. I do think that we need that prophetic witness. I think there's a place for it as long as it's nonviolent, as long as it doesn't endanger anybody. I do think it can get people's attention, but I think it just depends on your position. You know, if you have children dependent upon you, then you're in a different position than if you're a single person, let us say. And so anyway, but I think that there is a place for the prophetic, and I admire people who are convinced. I think also you have to look at it strategically. Sometimes such events engender more enemies than friends. I know I'm from San Francisco originally, and people would sometimes close the Golden Gate Bridge, and we're trying to get to work. And you know, so you got to weigh the options, I suppose, and that may or may not be the best action. But I think there's certainly, it shouldn't be ruled out. I don't think. It seems to me, as long as it's nonviolent, as long as you've considered the consequences, and if your cause is just and you feel that this is important, then I could see it being morally justified.
I think in terms of civil disobedience, the critical question is just that. Is this something which is going to actually advance the effort to bring about change? Are we undertaking the civil disobedience because it's going to be effective rather than because we just want to make a moral statement? And I think it can be a very effective tool, but we need to look at it carefully and decide whether this in fact is going to advance the conversation that we're trying to advance. There are other things that people can do short of civil disobedience that can be very, very effective. Pat Ferrone mentioned earlier that you know, the town of Needham had passed a resolution supporting Back from the Brink, one of the 17 towns in Massachusetts that have done so. I don't think she mentioned, I may have missed it, that also Santa Susanna Church, which I think is also in Needham, has also adopted a resolution supporting the Back from the Brink campaign. And one of the most effective things I think that could happen would be if many parishes across the state explicitly endorse the Back from the Brink campaign. That could have a huge impact on moving the state legislature, which, as I mentioned before, chose not to even vote on the Back from the Brink resolution this year, and could have a huge impact on our congressional delegation and build the kind of clear public support that our leaders seem to feel they need before they can do what they know is right. So I would encourage all of you to look at your local parish, at other organizations that you might belong to, civic organizations, professional associations, and get each of them to endorse the Back from the Brink campaign. There are over 400 organizations nationwide, from local church groups, national faith groups, labor unions, professional associations, Rotary clubs that have endorsed this campaign, and would like to see that number grow to 1,000 or 2,000 in the next couple of years.
And so we're coming to a close of the question and answer conversation portion of the evening. I hope that people were reading the chat box, because there was eloquent and beautiful statements being made throughout it, and a lot of calls for nonviolence, for movement from the church, for movement from the government. And so I hope that everyone was reading along for those comments, a lot of good resources. And again, we're going to be sending out a follow-up email that has links to a lot of these resources in it. I will hope that both speakers saw that there was so much gratitude and encouragement in the chat for the work that you're doing, how much it has affected people, changed people, and how much people feel it's made a difference. There were so many comments thanking you and talking about what it's meant, and calling for the Archbishop to be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize was even in there. So, so we thank you so much for your time this evening, for answering questions, for moving us to action. It's so inspiring, and we have so much gratitude for that. I also wanted to take a moment before we move to close to thank the committee from Sacred Heart and Our Ladies who put this together. Barbara Allaire, who was our fearless leader, put so much time in, and Richard Daggett, Ann Kaposha, Peg Morrison, Peter Metz, who we honestly wouldn't be here if Peter hadn't got us here. So thank you, Peter. And to St. Susanna's in Dedham, Pat and Phil, just the amount of time and care that you've given this, it's so encouraging. So I want to now introduce Barbara Allaire, who will be closing us in a prayer.
I come to this also full of gratitude, and I think all of us are full of gratitude. And so this prayer expresses that. God of all creation, you are the source of everything that is good. We are in awe of the beauty of the world you have given us. We hold dear all your gifts, this precious life, our families, our friends and communities, our whole planet that struggles to live in peace. We thank you, God, for our speakers tonight, Dr. Helfand and Archbishop Wester, who are unafraid to look into the abyss of nuclear weapons and disturb us with that reality, while offering hope through ways to act together responsibly to help rid the world of these weapons. We thank you for all who gathered here at this forum, seeking how to make a difference. For the witness of Pope Francis, who has said repeatedly, the possessing of nuclear weapons is immoral. We thank you, God. As Francis prayed at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial in 2019, come, Lord, for it is late. And where destruction has abounded, may hope also abound, that we can write and achieve a different future. Come, Lord, Prince of Peace, make us instruments and reflections of your peace. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you all for your time. We formally adjourn now and you're free to go. We're not going to slam the door closed on you though. So I'll be here for a few moments if you had a question or you were trying to share something with us. But thank you again to our speakers. This was so moving, enlightening, and inspiring. So thank you. I'll give you applause since you can't hear everybody else, even though I know they're applauding. And someone asked me if some of what I was saying was in my private chat, and this was recorded, so I think some of the chat will be captured in that. I'm not totally sure, but most of what I was saying was to everyone though, so you should have been able to see it. And if you want a chance to read the chat before you leave, you can hit the ellipses in the chat. You can save the chat to your own desktop and you can read through them if you didn't get a chance.